Good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and I'm joined by Helena NoJusticeMTG. Helena, how are you doing?
I'm doing very, very well. I had an excellent Sicilian lunch today, which was really, really good, and I've been high off of that all afternoon.
What does that mean? Is that those arancinis? Was there some deep fried rice balls, or
There was some arancini, yeah, absolutely. Some rigatoni as well, and some cannoli as well to finish off.
what's that like? What's the last thing you said? What does that consist of?
Cannoli, the little
cannoli,
kind of
the little
fried pastries, yeah.
the sugary thing in the pastry. Love it. That sounds like you've had a fantastic day. I still haven't had lunch actually. I just had some hot cross buns. I'm not looking after myself today, but I'll have a nice dinner, I'm sure. Coming up on tonight's show is Heathrow Airport expansion on the cards. Obviously, this has been a story that's been rolling for about 20 years. Labour indicating they might be in favour of it now. Elon Musk takes aim at Wikipedia. I know whose side I am on in that battle. And Donald Trump commutes the life sentence of the founder of Silk Road. It's interesting. I remember the Heathrow, for some sort of personal anecdotes. The same time in my life that sort of I was going on protests against Heathrow expansion on climate change, I was also sort of trying to buy drugs on Silk Road. I never quite managed it because I never managed to buy the Bitcoin that you needed to buy it, and it was all just too confusing for me. Prince Harry has been fighting a 6-year-long battle against news group newspapers over claims of illegal intrusion into his private life by The Sun, as well as phone hacking by the now defunct News of the World newspaper. And today, Harry appears to have won his battle after the group settled with the prince rather than face a civil trial today. This was Harry's barrister, David Sherborne, announcing the result outside court.
In a monumental victory today, News UK have admitted that The Sun, the flagship title for Rupert Murdoch's UK media empire, has indeed engaged in illegal practices. This represents a vindication for the hundreds of other claimants who were strong-armed into settling without being able to get to the truth of what was done to them. After endless resistance, denials, and legal battles by newsgroup newspapers, including spending more than £1 billion in payouts and in legal costs, as well as paying off those in the know, in order to prevent the full picture from coming out, News UK is finally held to account for its illegal actions and its blatant disregard for the law.
Now, at the start of that clip, you might have recognised former Labour Deputy Leader Tom Watson standing next to Sherborne. That's because, along with Harry, Watson had also brought a case against News Group for illegal intrusion into his private life while he was a government minister. And this is him speaking after the settlement.
These unlawful practices were not isolated incidents. They were industrial in scale and central to the modus operandi of News Group newspapers as a whole. I once said that the big beasts of the tabloid jungle have no predators. I was wrong. They have Prince Harry. His bravery and astonishing courage have brought accountability to a part of the media world that thought it was untouchable. I am sure I speak on behalf of the thousands of victims when I say we are grateful to him for his unwavering support and his determination under extraordinary pressure.
As part of the deal, News Group has published this apology to Prince Harry. They say News Group Newspapers offers a full and unequivocal apology to the Duke of Sussex for the serious intrusion by The Sun between 1996 and 2011 into his private life, including incidents of unlawful activities carried out by private investigators working for The Sun. NGN also offers a full and unequivocal apology to the Duke of Sussex for the phone hacking, surveillance and misuse of private information by journalists and private investigators instructed by them at the News of the World. NGN further apologises to the Duke for the impact on him of the extensive coverage and serious intrusion into his private life, as well as the private life of Diana, Princess of Wales, his late mother, in particular during his younger years. We acknowledge and apologise for the distress caused to the Duke and the damage inflicted on relationships, friendships and family, and have agreed to pay him substantial damages. And that does seem like a pretty comprehensive apology. there. Those damages are thought to amount to an 8-figure sum, so upwards of 10 million. That's according to the Financial Times. But it's worth noting that in the case of The Sun, News Group has only admitted to the unlawful activity of private investigators working for the paper. In other words, journalists, editors, and senior executives have been let off the hook. They said it was people working for us, but we didn't necessarily know. Some of those are likely to be pretty relieved that the case didn't go to trial. They include Will Lewis. He's current editor and CEO of The Washington Post, but in 2010 he was general manager of News International during the height of the news of the world illegal phone hacking scandal. Last summer, The Guardian revealed that a Scotland Yard special inquiry team had been set up to investigate Lewis over claims made by former Prime Minister Gordon Brown that Lewis had overseen a phone hacking cover-up at News International, including the deletion of emails. Lewis has denied all accusations of wrongdoing. Also likely to have been worried before this settlement was reached is News UK CEO Rebecca Brooks, who was expected to be named in the case. She edited The Sun between 2003 and 2009 before going on to become the CEO of News International. In 2014, Brooks was cleared of criminal charges involving phone hacking and conspiring to pervert the course of justice over her time at News International. But the admission by News Group that there was illegal activity at The Sun may now mean some of those issues get relitigated. Speaking to The World at One, this was former Sun editor Kelvin McKenzie.
And if it went to court, and with the names of very senior figures within the operation who were going to be called, that would have been very damaging, would it?
Oh, yeah, totally agree. I mean, the idea of what is in effect, although she is not a director of the company, Rebecca Brooks, the CEO, having to give evidence. I mean, it's a public company, having to give evidence on this kind of case would be, massively damaging. And it's difficult to know how she would survive such a cross-examination. But of course, after all, she was found not guilty at the Old Bailey some years ago.
Indeed, and that's why we now have Prince Harry's lawyer effectively accusing her of perjury, picking up that in that trial she said that at The Sun she ran a clean ship, and as he said, now 10 years later, she's CEO of the company, and they admit they ran, in his words, a criminal enterprise.
Well, I would say that there is now a massive question mark on how she can survive that change of course, to be honest. When you run a public company, the various aspects to it all, and having that statement put out, I mean, the fact that she survived at all is entirely due to the fact that she has Rupert Murdoch's patronage. Had this been a normal company, Mr. Murdoch and his family speak for a huge percentage of the voting equity, then she would never have survived anyway, not in any normal public company. So I would think you're now seeing the last days.
Right, but it has to be said,
here.
I mean, whilst Prince Harry's lawyer says that, the actual statement, the wording in the statement of the NGN apology refers only to the unlawful activities of private investigators working for The Sun.
Yes, but I presume the situation there is that people were, that somebody has to sign for it.
I've been in the same room as Rebecca Brooks once. It was I was a guest on Julia Hartley-Brewer's talk radio show. And, you'll know Julia Hartley-Brewer. She often seems very severe, can be quite confrontational. The moment Rebecca Brooks sort of walked past the big window, sort of the most dramatic tone shift I've ever seen. It's like, oh, hello, Rebecca. Oh. You could tell she was a woman with a lot of power in that building. Anyway, in an indication that this may not be the end of the road for those executives, this was Tom Watson speaking again today.
At the heart of this case, and all the 1,300 others, is the important principle that no one is above the law. And in this sense, today's result represents a challenge to the criminal justice system. I finish with two questions. To Sir Mark Rowley, when you receive our dossier exposing wrongdoing, will the Metropolitan Police act? To the Prime Minister, I know you care deeply about fairness and the law, but are we really willing to continue as a country where some corporate executives are above the law and out of the reach of the police?
Watson made reference there to 1,300 other civil cases brought against news groups since 2011. Those claimants accused the newspaper giant of hacking, illegal information gathering, and unwarranted intrusion into their lives, but agreed to settlements from the corporation. The total cost of News Group of those settlements, as well as legal fees, is thought to exceed £1 billion. The claimants who settled include household names like Elton John, Sienna Miller, and Hugh Grant, but they also include plenty of ordinary people whose lives were ruined by the Sun and the news of the world intruding into their lives, none of whom had access to the kind of resources Harry does. Now, it's worth noting this isn't Harry's first victory against a British tabloid. Back in 2023, Harry had his day in court over accusations Mirror Group newspapers had hacked his private communications. At the time, he was the first senior member of the royal family to take the stand in court since 1891, and he won that case, with the judge ruling he'd been the victim of widespread habitual hacking and awarding him £140,000. Small change for the prince, I would imagine. Harry settled further claims against the Mirror Group for at least £400,000. This was the reaction of Piers Morgan, who was Mirror editor at the time, of some of the accusations made by Harry.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Piers. What do you think about Harry's statement?
What do I think? I think that invading the privacy of the royal family is utterly reprehensible. And on that, I share Prince Harry's opinion. I just wish he'd stop doing it.
What about you? Do you wish you hadn't done it?
He knew perfectly well what was going on.
That was Piers Morgan about a year ago, and when Harry won his case against the Mirror Group. Harry also has a live case against another big newspaper, Associated Newspapers, which owns the Daily Mail and Mail Online. That case will go to trial in 2026. Now, to discuss today's developments and the legacy of the phone hacking scandal, I'm joined now by Stephen Barnett, Professor of Communication at the University of Westminster, and a board member of the campaign group Hacked Off. Thank you so much for joining us, first of all. Could you speak to us about the significance specifically of today's settlement? What does this mean?
Well, as David Sherborne said, the Sun have been denying for years, or News Group on behalf of the Sun have been denying for years, that they were involved in any unlawful information gathering at all. 1,300 people have settled their claims. There was absolutely no admission of any liability, strong-armed, as David Sherborne put it, to settle. So this is the first time that the Murdochs have actually accepted that the Sun were involved in unlawful information gathering, and in that sense, it is historic. I think David Sherborne was right to call it monumental.
And is it a bit of a disappointment that this hasn't gone to trial? Because obviously, then presumably we would have found out sort of even more about what had gone on. Is it a sort of disappointment that this settlement's been reached?
Yeah, I mean, okay, mixed feelings, I suppose. I was in court yesterday and today, actually, looking forward to seeing accountability in action. And there is a sense of disappointment, in particular, that the allegations of a cover-up, the fact that 30 million emails were deleted. You mentioned Will Lewis, who's now publisher of the Washington Post, who was involved in those allegations. He was involved in the management process during the height of the phone hacking scandal, and there were a number of allegations involving senior executives, including him and Rebecca Brooks and others, that there was a systematic attempt to conceal what had been going on, and they were going to be tested in court. And you mentioned the Mirror case quite rightly. The thing about Mirror Group was that there were allegations made; they'd been furiously denied. The evidence was put in court. There was cross-examination. The judge listened, and he found unequivocally that there had been extensive phone hacking by the Mirror, which then came out, lo and behold, and fessed up, threw up his hands and said, "We apologize." So there was a sense that there might have been some real accountability for what went on. But in the end, as the judge said in his final comments today, that's not really, a court of law is not really the place to air those kinds of issues around bigger issues of accountability. A court of law is there for two parties to decide between them whether they're going to pursue the case, and in this case, they decided not to for various reasons. But so that's a long-winded way of saying, yeah, mixed feelings. I think it's a great vindication for Prince Harry, and I think Tom Watson was right. We've got to hand it to the guy. He's taken an awful lot of nasty stuff poured all over his head for many, many years from the British press for doing what he's doing. And I hope his critics will now understand what's been going on behind the press vilification. That there's a reason for it. They did not want it to come to this. All kudos to Harry. The fact that we should rely on a very wealthy guy and a member of the royal family to get justice and the truth, I think speaks volumes about the state of the British justice system, but that's a different question.
And you've said sort of you see where the judge was coming from. This is a sort of case between two individuals, not necessarily not two individuals, an individual and a sort of corporate entity, but not necessarily the place to get to the truth. What would that place be? Would that have been sort of Leveson 2, that sort of public inquiry we were supposed to have? Is that what you'd like to see?
That. I mean, and I think that's essentially. I'm inferring now, but I think that's sort of what the judge was getting at, that there were issues here that needed to be determined. The fact that we were relying on a court of law to do that is not really appropriate. A lot of public money, let alone private money, involved. There were big questions here about who authorized illegality, at what level, how far up did it go, how extensive was it, how many years had it been going on. To what extent were the police involved and, I should say, complicit? Why wasn't it pursued more vigorously by the police at the time? Big questions there. All of those questions were to be answered by the second stage of the Leveson inquiry. And in fact, during the first stage, which I was involved in and I gave evidence twice, Lord Justice Leveson was very clear. There were certain things that we could not go into, could not discuss, because that was reserved for Part 2. And he didn't want to, quite rightly, prejudice any forthcoming trials. And then, of course, the press embarked on a systematic battle to undermine the Leveson report and, frankly, to intimidate successive governments and prime ministers into abandoning what would have been, for the UK press, a very embarrassing and difficult public inquiry. And Hancock, in the end, conceded 2018, I think it was, back down and said, we're not going to go ahead with it. And unfortunately, I'm afraid Keir Starmer's government has lacked the same kind of backbone and has also said they're not going to go ahead with it.
I suppose I want to sort of take this into a broader conversation about why people really should care. Because I suppose I sometimes have a tendency to look at this and I think, there's Prince Harry on one side and there's News International on the other. I find News International a bit more offensive than Prince Harry, but I mean, neither of them are my team, as it were. And it can seem a bit like a sort of intra-elite squabble. You've got celebrities and royals who want a bit more privacy. You've got News International who want to sort of invade their privacy. I can understand where both sides are coming from, but is it my battle, as it were? I mean, how would you respond to that?
That's a really good question, Michael. And I mean, I think the question is important on two levels. First of all, why does it matter to the general public? And the answer to that, I think, is very clear. I mean, in my involvement with the Hacked Off campaign, I have seen ordinary people, ordinary individuals, who simply become the victims of extraordinary events. They may have been involved in the 7/7 bombing. They may be related to people involved in the Manchester Arena bombing. If you think back to the McCanns, having they were just an ordinary couple who had their child kidnapped. So all of these people suddenly find themselves on the receiving end of the most intrusive tabloid press coverage, including the use of unlawful information gathering, whether it's not just phone hacking, blagging their record, their bank records, their phone records, their local authority records. So we hear about the celebs, we hear about the royal family and the Hugh Grants and the Sienna Millers. That's really not what this is about. They're the people who stood up to be counted because they've got the deep pockets. But you or I or anyone could actually be on the receiving end of some of this if we happen to be involved in some kind of major incident. And we're unlucky enough to become the focus of scrutiny and publicity by a click-hungry press, and a press in this country, I'm afraid, which lacks morality, which lacks ethics. So that's my first point. My first answer to your question is it's actually about the general public. It's not about celebs. But my second point, which is kind of implicit in the first, is about journalistic ethics, journalistic integrity. When the first phone hacking scandal first broke, you're a journalist, you'll understand this. I did quite a lot of international interviews. I did a lot of stuff on camera with European correspondents, the London correspondents of Die Welt and Le Monde and Washington Post. And almost without exception, the first question they asked before the cameras were rolling was, what is it about journalism in this country? How do you, can you explain why journalists have been doing this in the name of journalism? And the answer is because there has been, I'm afraid, a toxic culture at the heart of a few, not all, but a few major media organizations, newspaper organizations, which says anything goes. The most important thing is to get a scoop, get your name on the byline, get a front page splash, and if there's collateral damage with ordinary members of the public, tough. That's the way it goes. And that comes from the top. It comes from Murdoch, not just from Murdoch. It's associated newspapers, the Mail, the Express, even, I'm afraid, to some extent these days, the Telegraph. But it's at the tabloid level, the red top level, that it's been at its worst. And the answer, the bigger question is, what do you do about that? You have decent independent press regulation where the editor's code, which is supposed to be the gospel in terms of how journalists behave, actually means something. It's not just a kind of something that is written on a scrap of paper that journalists feel they can ignore, like broadcast journalism and even some online journalism. These things matter. So you need some kind of proper independent regulation, exactly what Leveson proposed, that will hold these journalists to account and will have actually have a genuine framework of what journalism should be about, rather than the kind of corrupted, toxic version that is practiced or has been practiced in some of our tabloid newspapers.
I suppose when this story sort of first broke in the early 2010s, one of the reasons it was quite, exciting in a way to watch is because Rupert Murdoch had seemed somewhat untouchable in British politics for a long time, sort of wielded extraordinary power over consecutive governments because he was seen as someone who could swing elections. And the fact that this scandal was coming out made it feel like, oh, finally they're being knocked off their perch. Finally, we can have this discussion about the Murdoch press or the tabloids or just the corporate press more generally in this country. We're in a very different situation now. In 2025, Rupert Murdoch, does he tower over British politics? It's it's more difficult to say with the rise of social media and the like. So do you still see, they're not on Fleet Street anymore, but sort of you normally call it Fleet Street. Do you see sort of the British newspapers as having political power in the way they used to? And I suppose a related question is, does holding them to account in something like a Leveson to, even, I think we should do it, but does it have as much urgency as it once did?
Well, the answer to the second question is yes. Why are we still asking about inquiries into infected blood, into the post office scandal? These are people. These are either conspiracies or corruption or incompetence from which there were real victims. And that's the same here. There were, hundreds, thousands of victims of press intrusion, press abuse, unlawful press activity. So we're not talking about something that kind of you shrug and say, well, it's not quite the same as having your living taken away by a corporation like the post office. Well, actually, for some people, I'm afraid it is. There are people who have lost their livelihoods because they have been abused by the press. So let's be consistent about this. If we want justice and accountability for people involved in whether it's infected blood or the post office, and there are others, why not the press? And I think there is a question for those people who've been on the receiving end. It's a matter of I'd quite like to see the people who did this brought to account. But I think there is a broader point which you started with, and it's a good point, which is, come on, it's the age of social media. Everyone's talking about TikTok and Instagram. Does any of this matter? My answer to that question is, why do you think that Starmer and Johnson before him and May before that, and sorry, I forgot Liz Truss, but the letters. But every consecutive prime minister has shied away from doing anything since Leveson, including Cameron. And the answer is they're still afraid of the press. Why are they afraid of the press? Two reasons. First, they think they still have the ability to sway people's opinion. Sun editorial. Think about the fuss during the election about which way the Sun was going to swing. Was it going to support Labour? When was it going to support Labour? How seriously was it going to support Labour? Those were actually news headlines. So politicians, political leaders still think the press sways public opinion. We'll leave to one side whether they're right or wrong. I think to some extent they might still be right. But the bigger question is setting the media agenda. Who sets the media agenda? Why is Starmer still concerned to write for The Sun, to brief The Telegraph, to make sure that his story is properly covered in the Times, etc.? The reason is the press in this country still sets the agenda. Maybe not as much as it did 20, 30 years ago, certainly not 40 or 50 years ago, but it's still very influential. Politicians are aware of that. They maybe exaggerate it in their own minds, but they're certainly sufficiently aware of it to continue to be afraid of it. And I think that fear itself actually speaks volumes about why something needs to be done.
Stephen Barnett, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Really fascinating stuff. No one expected Donald Trump to be a climate-friendly president, and if his first 48 hours are anything to go by, he certainly won't be. Trump has already signed an executive order pulling the United States out of the Paris Climate Accords, and he has now halted more than $300 billion in green infrastructure funding. According to the Financial Times, the funds affected were provided under two of Biden's signature legislative achievements, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and include almost $50 billion in Department of Energy loans already agreed and another $280 billion worth of loan requests under review. That's pretty significant. If you're a business and you've been promised these £50 billion of loans to invest in some infrastructure, you're going to be a bit annoyed about this. The FT piece also includes a quote from a senior analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence who said, if you had grants, loan guarantees, funding that was sort of tied in with the IRAs, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the money's not out the door yet, it's going to be very hard to see that money going out of the door under the Trump administration. Very worrying. Obviously, the IRA was one of the decent things Biden did, sort of throwing money at businesses to do green investment. Now, you might prefer them to sort of have a bit more stick and a bit less carrot. Biden decided that the only way you can get this done is to give businesses loads of money to do it instead of taxing them for the bad things. It's not ideal, but better than nothing. Trump seems to be getting rid of it. There is, though, a silver lining. Not all of the money will dry up. The Financial Times say, unlike the money in the loans office, the IRA's tax credits, which they say is the main form of subsidy in the legislation, are unlikely to be affected. The credits have been a primary driver of investment, with manufacturers committing more than $130 billion since the law passed. So sort of the legacy of the Inflation Reduction Act won't be completely destroyed. There'd been lots of speculation about this, which was quite interesting before Trump took office, which was that while Trump is ideologically opposed to the Inflation Reduction Act, lots of the money had gone to red states because that's where actually green industry seems to be flourishing in America. And so there would be lots of pressure on Donald Trump to keep the Inflation Reduction Act going. It seems he hasn't been particularly persuaded, although, yeah, it remains to be seen what proportion of the IRA he will roll back. Let's go back to the first issue I mentioned, which is Trump taking the United States out of the Paris Accords. As I said earlier, this is no surprise, but there are a couple of aspects of this story that have emerged today that are a bit more curious. The first is that Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, has refused to pass judgment on the decision. That led to this exchange on Politics Live between a Labour MP and a climate campaigner.
Can I just show you this in the Times? Starmer refuses to condemn Trump's Paris Agreement withdrawal. What do you make of that? Should he be?
Well, it's not for a British Prime Minister to comment on domestic politics of another country. But on the issue...
Sorry, I can't get over the fact that you said a Labour government will not comment on other countries' decisions. I didn't think it would be a Labour government that would fuel the end of internationalism. That global agreement was historic, and lots of governments and countries and movements work together to secure it. It's the only globally binding climate agreement that we have that secures our futures. And if Labour won't defend that, what is the point of a Labour government?
I can see why Keir Starmer is sort of being pragmatic. Trump is the president. He'll be president for the next 4 years. He is someone who sort of takes politics very personally. You can see why you want to stay on the right side of him for trade and such like. But an MP sort of describing the Paris Accords as a piece of domestic policy. Like if there was one decision an American president can make that affects us all, right? Other than sort of pressing the nuclear button, then pulling out of the climate accords is up there, right? If there's one influence that an American president has that affects people outside of America, it's their climate policy. So if there's one single thing you can comment on when it comes to Trump, surely it's pulling out of the Paris Accords. It's considered domestic policy. Just be honest. The Labour MP should just say, well, we're not going to give our opinion because Trump, he's just been elected. And we want to stay on his side. He's a deal maker. We kind of get that. I'd respect that a bit more. The other element of this story that's interesting is how different corporate America has responded to Trump's withdrawal this time around compared to when he made the same move in 2017. Lots of this is Groundhog Day, right? Trump moved the Americans out of the Paris Accord back in 2017. There's actually sort of a 4-year waiting period before it happened. So before that ended, Biden put them back in. Now Trump's back in office. He's taking them back out again. Sort of in, out, shake it all about kind of thing. But the difference this time around is when he did it in 2017, Elon Musk tweeted this. I'm departing presidential councils. Climate change is real. Leaving Paris is not good for America or the world. So he was then on this sort of advisory council with businesses advising the president. He resigned from that because he thought it was so outrageous that Trump had left the Paris Accords, of course, now a close advisor to Donald Trump. And Musk wasn't the only super wealthy business leader to speak up. Bob Iger, chief executive of Walt Disney, joined Musk in resigning from that advisory group. So he was also on it. He said this at the time, again, this is 2017. As a matter of principle, I've resigned from the President's Council over the Paris Agreement withdrawal. Apple's CEO, Tim Cook, said this. I spoke with President Trump on Tuesday and tried to persuade him to keep the US in the agreement, but it wasn't enough. I want to reassure you that today's developments will have no impact on Apple's efforts to protect the environment. Mark Zuckerberg, a real roll call of people who are now cozying up to Donald Trump. This is what he said back in 2017. Withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement is bad for the environment, bad for the economy, and puts our children's future at risk. Stopping climate change is something we can only do as a global community, and we have to act together before it's too late. So that was when Mark Zuckerberg was still woke before he sort of dropped all that, said, I didn't really mean it. I'm actually sort of a street cage fighting bro or whatever. As you can tell, those were pretty strong words back in 2017. And what do we get now? Crickets. All of those people not only not saying anything about him withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, but sucking up to Donald Trump as well. So what is going on here? What changed? Well, there are a number of possible explanations. Perhaps the most obvious is that Trumpism seems much more permanent and powerful this time around than it did in 2017. He didn't win the popular vote. Back then, he seemed like an aberration. Now people are saying, okay, the politics this guy represents are here to stay. Another explanation or another possible explanation could be that climate change has become even more entangled in a culture war than it was in 2017. And more importantly, I think execs like Musk and Zuckerberg, who once might have sort of pitched themselves as being on the liberal side, whether that was genuine or not, they're now very openly allied to the conservative side of that conflict. There's a third possible explanation, though, which I thought was interesting, tweeted by blogger Matt Iglesias today. He said, "I think an underrated dynamic is that tech executives pushed hard for green policy when they saw themselves as running companies that were very low on energy intensity compared to manufacturing, and flipped their view rapidly as it became clear that AI needs a lot of electricity." So they suddenly sort of switched from being, having an interest in green policies to now thinking they're quite problematic. And then this replied to him from an energy, or I think a pollster actually, I found very interesting. Avery James says, "Yes, it puts them closer to car factories whose executives vote got to the Republicans than movie studios whose executives vote Democrat in energy consumption. And Elon was ahead of the trend because he literally runs car factories." Helena, I thought this was really interesting. You've got this sort of massive switch of corporate America from being very skeptical of the first Trump presidency to being completely on board this time around. That does mean that he seems like he's going to be more unrestrained. I've provided a sort of bunch of potential explanations for why they've flipped on climate. What do you make of those? Do you have any sort of other hypotheses you want to throw into the pot?
Well, when it comes to the Matt Iglesias tweet there, I think I disagree pretty strongly on this one. One of the things that these subsidies were for were massively increasing the supply of energy. If you want energy security, if you want to ensure that you have prosperous energy supply, abundant energy supply to run loads of AI data centers potentially in terms of energy consumption, it doesn't really matter where that power comes from as long as it's there. We know from the fact that China is a big manufacturing base of a country, and they have already switched on to the idea that energy abundance is going to come from green energy, hence why they've installed more photovoltaic capacity in 2024 than America has done its entire history combined. So when it comes to energy security and maximizing energy production and abundance to feed into the amount of energy that's going to be necessary to be able to put through what they want, either be a new US manufacturing boom potentially, or this move towards AI data centers and all the kind of energy high intensity projects that might come from the new wave of technology. I don't think that's necessarily something that's going to be on these CEOs' minds, as Matt Iglesias says. I think the statement that you made about climate change being part of the culture war, or at the very least, there being a kind of a synthesis of economic and political power within the Trump administration, the oligarchy that's been referred to by people like Bernie Sanders and others. I think that's more of the kind of I think this is more of the kind of reason as to why we're seeing this change in strategy from a lot of these CEOs moving forward. What is interesting, though, what I find quite interesting, is just how easy it was to get these people to switch. So remember when Elon Musk initially said that he was going to back Donald Trump. They did a space on Twitter, or sorry, X, the everything app. They did a space together, and they literally had a discussion over climate change, over electric vehicles. And you could literally try and see Elon Musk trying, sort of, to convince Trump on climate policy. And then as soon as Trump wasn't in no point actually going to acquiesce to what Elon Musk was saying, he immediately just kind of capitulated and said, okay, well, we won't do that. Trump is ideologically committed to big oil. He is, of course, entangled with big oil and things like that. And this is a political and economic project that is going to be difficult to disentangle from the current administration. And the CEOs want in on that. They don't want to become enemies of the people who are politically powerful so that they can get access to favorable state policy economically. Obviously, Elon Musk is very obviously doing this because he wants to increase the value of Tesla stock. He wants to get more subsidies for SpaceX. He wants to stop high-speed rail like he did with the Hyperloop over in California. And it's these similar kind of transactional relationships with political power that I think these CEOs are trying to angle for. What I also find quite funny is that in the 2020 to 2024 period, the dissident right, the kind of the right-wing conspiracy theorist types, they were convinced that there was a World Economic Forum, Globo Homo conspiracy to try and make you eat the bugs. And that's why all of these corporations, it's why BlackRock, who've now divested from climate policy, were all in on climate policy, why you were seeing it in all of the social media spaces, and climate change was being fact-checked on YouTube and things like that. And they thought it was a conspiracy to try and take away the prosperity of Americans, or for their generation. This is usually kind of Gen X's, boomers that are into this kind of stuff. They genuinely believe that this was something that was being done so that you would own nothing and be happy. That's what they were going with, because they thought that it was an ideological project that was being done from the top down by the executives, by the CEOs, and not just a response to a political project. Because, of course, in the UK, we're actually very pro-climate, but America is far more of a contentious issue over there, so it's very difficult to get everybody on board with it. And then turns out none of this was true. They weren't doing these things because they were personally ideologically motivated. Tim Cook and Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, all these people, they weren't 100% ideologically in bed with the idea of saving the planet. They thought that was the political direction moving forward, and they went where the wind was blowing. They thought, well, I can appeal to more people by doing these things. And so that's where my profit margins lie. Because the CEOs, they have a single duty. It's not to the planet, it's not to the people, it's not to democracy, it's not to broad social utility. No. It's towards one singular goal, which is maximizing value for shareholders. And so as soon as they thought they would get more value by cozying up to the Trump campaign, they did it. It wasn't a conspiracy. They were just responding to how the markets were perceived to be acting at the time, which is, of course, the basics of capitalism. It's very interesting how a bunch of these people who were very on board with capitalism couldn't understand it when it came to how corporations pitch their messaging to the public.
You mentioned there that climate is a bit more divisive in the United States than it is here. There is a divisive issue when it comes to the climate in the UK that's back in the headlines, though. This is because it seems as if Labour might be about to approve Heathrow. On Monday, Bloomberg published a report suggesting the UK government were poised to back expansion at Heathrow and other airports in the south east. Bloomberg reported this. Ministers are set to publicly signal support for a long-sought third runway at Heathrow, sign off on plans to bring the second strip at Gatwick into full-time use, and allow an increase in the capacity at Luton Airport, according to people familiar with the matter, who asked for anonymity, discussing plans that haven't been finalised. As briefed to Bloomberg, the announcements would be made in a speech by Rachel Reeves later this month, which would signal support for lots of high-profile projects which have been subjected to decades of delay. And the idea is to show Labour is serious about growth. But in a development that would surprise nobody, the briefing has led to talks of splits in the party. Ed Miliband, who has responsibility for the UK's net zero commitments, is understood to be opposed, as are Sadiq Khan and Andy Burnham. And awkwardly for the government, 8 ministers who attend cabinet voted against the Heathrow plan in the House of Commons back in 2018, including Keir Starmer, who as recently as 2020 was tweeting things like this. Congratulations to the climate campaigners. There is no more important challenge than the climate emergency. That is why I voted against Heathrow expansion. If you look at the date, you can see that Starmer was in fact still running as Labour leader when he sent that. So is this another issue on which Keir Starmer has changed his mind? Green Party leader, or co-leader, Adrian Ramsey, asked him at today's PMQs.
Expanding London's airports and building a third runway at Heathrow would be incredibly irresponsible in the midst of a climate emergency, flying in the face of the Climate Change Committee's advice. The Prime Minister clearly knows this because he and 7 Cabinet colleagues voted against a third runway at Heathrow in 2018. So can the Prime Minister confirm what is his position now?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to comment on speculation. He knows that we are, as a government, we are committed to growth, we're committed to the aviation sector and to our climate obligations. But I'm not going to take lectures from those who talk about climate change but oppose vital renewable infrastructure in their own constituency.
As far as I understand, that's the thing that gets thrown at the Green Party anytime they say anything in Parliament. He's referring to Adrian Ramsey having opposed some electricity pylons in his constituency, which had been intended to transport green energy across Britain. So I think maybe it was from sort of offshore wind, sort of be held to that. But it was some sort of green infrastructure that he opposed because his local constituents didn't want these ugly pylons. Rachel Reeves wasn't at PMQs. Instead, she's been at Davos, where she said this about her stance on Heathrow.
We've already taken a number of big decisions on City Airport, on Stansted Airport, on a number of planning decisions that this government have called in that were on the desks of ministers in the previous government, on housing, on data centres, in the creative industries. I'm not going to sort of comment on speculation about what I may or may not say next week, but Johnny started with a sort of pitch that Britain is an open, trading, vibrant economy. We want to remain as such.
To use your example of taking tough decisions, if you push ahead with Heathrow, that might cause problems with Sadiq Khan, might cause problems with your colleague Ed Miliband from Environment.
This is the problem with the last government. There was always somebody that said, oh, yes, of course we want to grow the economy, but we don't like that investment. Oh, we don't like that wind farm. We don't like those pylons. We don't like that airport. We don't want that housing near us. The answer can't always be no. And that's been the problem in Britain for a long time, that when there was a choice between something that would grow the economy and sort of anything else always won.
Elena, I know you're a bit of a YIMBY like me. You want more stuff to get built. But what's your view on Heathrow expansion?
I genuinely don't have a firm opinion on this, and I can really see a lot of the different sides to each part of this discussion. I mean, broadly, we need to reduce the amount of aviation that we're doing. We do need to do that, I mean, globally, to try and reduce overall emissions. But of course, when you look at what this expansion would potentially give us, an extra 260,000 flights, I think was the BBC's reporting on this. There are over, 5 million private flights every year globally. So in terms of the people who are actually to blame for the large amount of emissions that per person, the super rich are the people. We want to ban private jets, then, I'm super down on these kind of things. Frequent flyer taxes, we can definitely do that. When it comes to expanding the capacity of Heathrow, which is usually either used as a transport hub for people going between the transatlantic flights and in Europe flights, or whether it's being done for tourists flying out of the UK to elsewhere, reducing the amount of flights that people can do where they're just flying a couple of times a year and making the actual service more efficient by having a third runway, I can see this kind of argument. Then with regards to building things in the local area, well, people might be under a flight path after it gets built, who wouldn't have been before, but people who are just under the flight path of runways 1 and 2 might therefore have a little bit less of the flight paths over them moving forward if things become a bit more spread out between the 3 one-ways. So there's some push and pull with regards to this. We will then get much higher tax revenues if more people are using Heathrow as a transport hub because it's got higher capacity. That's more tax revenue on aircraft passenger duty, which is billions of pounds worth of tax revenue every single year, plus fuel duty for people refueling at Heathrow as well. So there's kind of myriad factors that are baked into whether or not we should do these things. And broadly, if you want to be a prosperous society with, we've got an increasing population, we're going to have to increase the capacity of things such as transport. Should that be aircraft rather than, trains up between the north and the south? Should we be giving ourselves extra capacity for internal flights when these could be done through high-speed rail, for example? That's also a conversation that we should be having. So I find it very difficult when I'm somebody who genuinely cares about climate change and the environment. These are super things that are really important. When it comes into contact with class issues and we say, well, how are we doing this yet we're not banning private jets or taxing frequent flyers? When this could be an easy trade-off and say, well, if we're going to increase capacity for regular tourist aircraft going out of Heathrow, or to try and maximise our tax revenue from it being used as a transport hub, which it is used all the time, then we can balance that by having certain excise duty elsewhere to try and prevent the large amount of flights which are unnecessary or are being done by people who are already overusing their share of the world's global carbon emissions through aviation. And when you look at the actual capacity of Heathrow, it is the busiest airport in the world. The second busiest, only by a very small margin, is Charles de Gaulle, and they have double the number of runways that Heathrow does. So it's clearly being underserviced in its current level of capacity. But then you've also got to look, there's regional inequalities too. Andy Burnham was making this point. Why are we looking at more transport infrastructure in London specifically, centralising literally everything in the capital, which we seem to have been doing ad infinitum for the past 40, 50 years, when we could be looking at further expansion in our regional airports, Manchester, Leeds, anywhere around in the north. And we aren't looking at that kind of investment. There was, all of the shades of the levelling up of the early 2020s under Boris Johnson. That's all gone away. So much so for devolution, putting power into people around the country, just constantly enlarging everything in London. having all our prosperity in London specifically, you'd notice that all the other airport expansions they're planning, which is Luton and Gatwick, and already having London City Airport, they're all London-centric airports too. And this is another thing of regional inequality. So I don't know what your opinion on this is, Michael, but I have real conflicting positions on this when fundamentally aviation has to be curtailed at least somewhat with regards to climate change. But how you do that fairly, how you do that equitably, and how you do that whilst still ensuring that we have a prosperous economy, that's going to be a difficult problem to tease out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also in two minds on this one. And as I said, as I said at the start, I think it was 2006. I just looked up. That was when Climate Camp was at Heathrow, sort of to stop expansion. So I used to feel very strongly about this. I suppose where I stand, in response to a couple of things you said. So you've said we could expand it and still we'd expand Heathrow for ordinary people, but then tax frequent flyers. Now, what that sort of raises for me is that once a bit of infrastructure gets built, there's going to be a lot of pressure for it to get used. And so I think it would, I think if you get the extra capacity, then Heathrow is going to be desperate to fill it. And so industry will be quite opposed to the idea of sort of implementing policies that stop frequent flyers, which would then leave a load of spare capacity at Heathrow, which they'll have it would end up being a bit of a stranded asset. In terms of sort of the regional element of this, I mean, I think it is ridiculous that they're considering sort of having a third Heathrow runway before doing Northern Powerhouse Rail, which seems to me to be something that would add so much more value, both economically and socially. I suppose their argument would be, well, Northern Powerhouse Rail was going to be paid for by the government, and this is just giving approval to Heathrow, who are going to pay for it themselves because they think it's going to, they think it's going to be profitable. There's, arguments that you'll have to have some sort of public infrastructure around it. I know Heathrow have said they'll also pay for the roads and sort of rail networks. When it comes to the climate issue, though, I suppose where I've really changed on this issue is because we're 1% of global emissions. Obviously, we have a moral responsibility to reduce our emissions. But the thing that really matters is what can we do that sets an example and can be exported everywhere. And the reason I think sort of getting to sort of net zero in our electricity system is a really good idea is because if we prove you can do that and it doesn't sort of affect your growth rates and your quality of life, then other people will say, okay, great, yeah, we can do that too. I think if we don't expand Heathrow Airport, no one's going to say, oh yeah, well, they didn't expand their airport and there wasn't any, I think the example Britain is setting at the moment is people saying, well, if you don't build stuff, you're probably going to stagnate. Like we haven't built stuff and we've stagnated. I don't think anyone's sort of in their arguments about airport expansion saying, let's do what the Brits have done. So the things I'm passionate about is developing technologies that can be exported, setting examples that people want to follow. And I mean, I probably err on the side of don't build the third runway, but I'm not passionate about it because it doesn't actually really fit into my sort of vision for how we solve the climate crisis, which is we invest in really important technologies. We show that industrial policy means you can be prosperous and green, and then people want to follow that. And Heathrow to me seems kind of irrelevant to that one way or the other. Do you want a quick response to that before we move on to our next story?
What I would say is that I don't necessarily think that expansion would lead to more flights or overall as well. I think I would add is that as a hub airport, there is a potential that a lot of these extra flights would be using Heathrow rather than somewhere else. It might just be a transfer of capacity from other airports to Heathrow. And all that does, it doesn't change the amount of emissions. That just means more tax revenue for us. It just means more people paying airport passenger duty and paying for fuel duty in Heathrow than otherwise would be. But again, I think I share everything that you've said there. I think that's a really good perspective. I definitely agree.
I thought we were going to have a bit more of a Barney there because you're a Green Party member, aren't you? So that's you're a bit with some distance from Adrian Ramsey.
I mean, to be fair, I was streaming yesterday and he was on Cross Question when we were watching it, and I describe him as Pylon Man because that's what he's known as now. He's what he's known in, like, when we talk about the Green Party, I keep banging my head against the wall, speaking with people, well, I can't vote Green because that guy said no to some pylons. And I was like, well, he didn't actually say no. He said, let's have a pause and do some underground cabling. Something I disagree with. It's massively expensive, makes it more expensive to be able to repair as well. The pylons are cheaper and people will forget. When you build it, they just forget about the pylons after they've been mad about it for 6 months or whatever. So making that be the kind of the totemic thing people remember the Green Party for, partially through some level of poor dissemination of information, but also I think poor optical policy. I find that very frustrating. But I think that there is to solve the climate crisis, we need to be able to put people into government, into office, into elected to parliament, who are going to appeal to enough people that we can get actual policy passed. It's no good having policy that no one wants to vote for when we sit in the wings whilst the oil billionaires rake in millions, right? There's got to be a practical application of policy to ensure people want to vote for it. And saying, well, we can't have a prosperous society if we go green, that's something that we can't politically pitch to people. So that's something that's a square that we have to circle.
There are always two visions of how the internet could work. One vision saw the internet as providing the possibility for a collaborative, open source public realm where knowledge could be freely shared by an active citizenry. An alternative sees the internet as a realm of proprietary technology where mega corporations and billionaires compete for our attention, collect our data, sell us stuff, and amass ever more political control. Musk's X falls into the latter camp. He used his billions of dollars to buy up a private platform, demand the world's attention, and find his way to the White House. But if there is still a platform that represents the first, more utopian vision, the most obvious candidate is Wikipedia. Wikipedia is one of the world's most visited websites. It doesn't make a profit and combines the knowledge and effort of over 100,000 volunteer editors to maintain the 7 million articles it currently has in English. I use it multiple times a day. It's more valuable to me than any of the newspaper subscriptions that I actually pay for. And to be honest, I trust its content more. Right? I remember sort of at school, teachers always said, oh, you don't want to get your information from Wikipedia. But actually, it's really, really reliable. I think people say it's just as reliable as Encyclopedia Britannica, which is the paid version. So who do you think has come for Wikipedia today or yesterday? No prizes for getting it right. Elon Musk tweeted, defund Wikipedia until balance is restored. He was quote tweeting something showing that the word far right is used more than the word far left on the platform. Wikipedia's founder, Jimmy Wales, posted this in response on X. I think Elon is unhappy that Wikipedia is not for sale. I hope his campaign to defund us results in lots of donations from people who care about the truth. If Elon wanted to help, he'd be encouraging kind and thoughtful, intellectual people he agrees with to engage. Now, that's an interesting point at the end there, because looking at this today, I'm not an expert on this, but it does seem like studies have suggested there is a bit of a liberal bias if you were to sort of look for one on Wikipedia. But if it does exist, it's just because the editors tend to be a little bit more liberal. And Jimmy Wales is saying, look, I've made this open source project that doesn't have an agenda and which is extraordinarily reliable. If you think it's biased, encourage your people to engage in the editing process. And then, it's a really democratic sort of commons, really. Helena, what do you think of Elon Musk coming for Jimmy Wales?
I mean, it's just the same kind of cope that we saw from conservatives over fact-checking on social media, right? Oh, we're constantly getting fact-checked. It's got a liberal bias, etc., etc. And I was like, have you considered that you're just wrong more often? Or have you considered that more of the facts just happen to align with things that are less conservative? It seems to me that's mostly been the case, right? The answer wasn't from, say, Facebook, let's get in more fact checkers who are more conservative. It's like, no, let's just get rid of it. Because again, you have to actually back these things up with sources, as you do indeed on Wikipedia. You have to back these things up with sources. I find it quite funny that you see the Jimmy Wales tweet with rate proposed community notes. Well, isn't that what Wikipedia is? Basically just a big community notes, except you have to actually put sources in how you link where the information is coming from so that it can actually be fact checked through primary sourcing and citation. There's a lot of hot air, I think, over the level to which Wikipedia can be edited and changed. So it's really meaningless. Well, no, you have to properly source things. People who are in the background ensure that the information that you are providing has been properly sourced and they go back through the material. So this is something with a lot of levers in the mechanism to ensure that the information that you're reading on Wikipedia is good quality information. But of course, good quality information that disagrees with conservatives, that's not what they want, because that's what's politically biased against them, regardless of the actual veracity of what is being put in there. When it comes to the thing that has caused Elon Musk to talk shit on Wikipedia, saying, well, there's more mentions of far-right extremism than far-left extremism. Well, let's just have a look at the amount of extremism that we've seen, let's say, over the past half a century. It's been quite a while since Red Army faction, hasn't it? And I'm sure when we actually look at the historic nature of extremism across the world globally, there's been far more instances of far-right extremism, outwardly far-right extremism, where we see lots of, we've seen MPs killed by far-right extremists. We have seen far-right terror attacks across America. Globally, we've seen these things happen a lot. And of course, when you look at Islamist terrorism, a lot of these things are right-wing in nature as well. And when the far left, they're busy being politically ineffective, reading Critique of the Gotha program in their Marxist book clubs, right? As a far leftist, I think we are pretty unimaginative in the level to which that we actually do the practice we say we should do. But there's not been that many examples of far left extremism that you could really use as an example for this, whereas the far right extremism is on the up and up, as we see every single day. And one last point, to try and claim that the bias in Wikipedia is somehow due to Jimmy Wales, I think is quite funny, because that man's quite literally an objectivist, like a Randian objectivist, a libertarian right-winger. I mean, interesting that he seems to actually put his, unlike a lot of libertarians, he's putting his actual beliefs into practice by saying, well, let's give this to the people in a kind of anarchist sense rather than in an anarcho-capitalist sense. But he is an anarcho-capitalist in his own personal beliefs. So the idea that he would just create a platform that's deliberately biased into a political opinion that doesn't agree with him, I find that highly unlikely.
Yeah, actually, Jimmy Wales in the Corbyn years sort of joined in a pile-on calling me anti-Semitic after I did a video for Momentum. So I don't have any personal really liking towards the gentleman, but I'll still use his website multiple times a day, even if I do feel less inclined to donate. Elena, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
It's been a pleasure, Mike. Thank you as always.
And thank you guys for watching. We'll be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.